Hey, welcome back. We've talked a lot about how the president has various jobs, but one of the jobs that's the most obvious is to be a servant of the people in the government. And I'd love to start off talking about the president and the interaction with the people by looking at a historical example. When Andrew Jackson was elected president at the beginning or in the early 19th century, he at his inauguration, for his inauguration party, actually invited the people into the White House and had a giant, huge wheel of cheese that the people could eat off of. Andrew Jackson is known as the people's president because he was well respected by the people and as a result won great victories. He was a war hero and he goes on to really revolutionize the presidency. But importantly, he looks at the presidency as a vehicle to represent the people, which was new for his day. So let's talk about how the president interacts with the people and uses the people for his advantage, if you will. The president is definitely a public figure, and that public support is the greatest source of influence. If the public appreciates what the president is doing, agrees with what the president is doing, he builds social capital. And a lot of the time, appearances are staged. It's political theater to get the public's attention. As head of state, a lot of things happen that bring attention to the president as an international leader. All of this is done to build that social capital. If we're looking at political capital in this case, what we can see is the fluctuating approval ratings. And I wanted to point out this chart from the Gallup poll. These are the approval ratings that the Gallup organization tracks all the way back to Truman on this chart. And you can see that as a presidency goes on, there are peaks and valleys, there are rises and falls. But typically, you can track all of these things based on the major events of the presidency. And you can see where President Obama is at this point. If we look right here, you can see that the president is on his way down, definitely below the 50% line, and has hovered there for a long time. But I want to add a couple of layers to each of these. If we look here, these are the approval ratings among Democrats. And there's a couple of things to note here. Obviously, if you look at President Obama, he's going to be higher among Democrats. If you look at President Bush, lower. And of course, you can basically tell where the president lies, or what the political affiliation is, based on their approval ratings. I do want to point out something interesting, though, that if we look here, in particular at President Bush, does fairly well amongst Democrats. He was more of a moderate Republican, different from today's modern-day Republican Party. Now, if we were to look at Republican approval ratings, you can see the opposite. Obviously, the Republican presidents have higher approval ratings. They tend to go in similar tracks. There's just a big gap in the difference there. I wanted to point out something I think is very interesting, and it tells us a lot about where we are politically, and that is the approval rating among independents. And the approval rating among independents is almost exactly what the approval rating of the presidency is in general. And I wanted to point that out because if we look at the approval ratings of independents of the president, you know, we're always going to have people who are very Republican or very Democrat, but we are always fighting for the middle as the president, and that's an important thing to see in terms of the historical trend of those approval ratings. Now, if we look at that public presidency, presidential approval is a big deal in the White House. There's a lot of factors that change public approval. If there's a wartime president, for example, after the attacks on 9/11, if you look back on the approval rating chart, it skyrockets for President Bush. And then it wanes, but it was very unified as a country. There's often the honeymoon period after an election, and as you could see, those trends go down. But those changes in a presidential approval rating can highlight good decisions or bad decisions in light of the public's opinion. The White House often is seeking to have a win-the-week mentality. They want to go through and staff things and set events up to put the president in the best light. So that week they win and they get higher approval ratings as a result. That win the week mentality is something that comes out of the White House office. And a good example of that would be when Barack Obama most recently went on Between Two Ferns with Zach Galifianakis. There was a particular point to that, to appeal to a younger demographic who watches that and enjoys that show on Funny or Die, but it was really to promote enrolling in the healthcare programs. The deadline was coming up, and the president used that public vehicle, very non-presidential, typical presidential vehicle, but use that to reach out to people, young people in particular. If we look at how the president accesses people, it's through the press. The president and the media are definitely adversaries. The presidents see the media as hurting the image of the president. The media sees it as their responsibility to share the news. There's a lot of people within the White House office that deal with the media on a daily basis, both on and off the record, but the main contact person is the White House press secretary, and is an important part of those the meetings that happen within the White House executive office. In order to portray the image, to win the week, the media is definitely more interested in the person of the president and the person that's making the decisions and the decision process, not necessarily the policy itself. Over time, the news coverage has become more negative, but we can also look at it and say that the news coverage changes depending on who the president is, as you can kind of see in this political cartoon. Anyway you look at it, though, the press is the vehicle by which the president gets the public message out there, and can help the president either win or lose the week. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.